Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having an awesome morning. You got my intro, so I don't need to repeat it. I lead product for Atlassian Access, and it's super exciting to be on stage in Las Vegas at my 10th Atlassian Summit. Personally, I'm not actually a huge Vegas fan. Don't really gamble or do bright lights, but it does hold a special place in my heart. Actually, 7 years ago, I took a trip out here, and like most Vegas nights when you're in your early 20s, got pretty late. We were out. We did some drinking, ended up at a classy joint called Denny's, just a few blocks up the strip from here. And we were trying to soak up the liquor with some waffles at about 4 in the morning, and I thought that was a good time to talk to the girl that was sitting across from me that I kind of liked and ask her on a date with me. And for some reason, at that Denny's at 4 in the morning in Las Vegas, good time, she said yes. And last year we actually got engaged, and she said yes to marrying me. I couldn't actually find a good way to weave that into my talk, but the point is, that was my first love, and my second love is Atlassian customers. So Vegas is all about things that I love. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask any of you to marry me. And actually, I'm not going to try to convince you of anything at all. You've heard a lot about cloud and the awesome stuff that we're doing in cloud, but this is not a here's what's awesome in cloud, here's why you should migrate to cloud talk. I'm not going to talk about cool new features or potential cost savings or never having to do another Jira upgrade. If you want to hear that, we've got plenty of content for that. This is a presentation about cloud reality. If you're already using Atlassian in the cloud, or you're considering migrating some or all of your app usage to the cloud, or even if you're not doing anything with Atlassian in the cloud at all, but you're just managing other applications in the cloud in your portfolio, then I want to share some practical tips that can help you make sure you run those applications at scale and securely. So I want to start by imagining that this lovely pool is an instance of Jira or Confluence that you're running on premises. There we go. So accessing this pool is pretty low risk. You've got a ladder, it's pretty shallow. Maybe you can jump in off that small diving board in the bottom. And that's all because it's protected by this nice fence, your corporate firewall. But in the cloud, access patterns look a little bit higher risk. So I don't think my speaking skills have improved that much in 5 summits, but my keynote presentation skills animations have improved dramatically. So where's this risk coming from? There are 3 key trends that are converging on IT administrators. First, because SaaS makes it so much easier to build an app, there are just more apps available to solve every kind of specific business problem. And then second, because those apps solve different business problems, they're adopted bottoms up by so many more teams throughout the organization. There's just more people using SaaS applications. And then third, all of those people, they have cell phones, they have a tablet, they work from home sometimes. And so they're using more and more devices in more and more locations to access those services. And all of that manifests in a couple of distinct challenges that IT administrators face when you're going to the cloud. So the first is just a raw increase in the number of security threats you're going to face. 70% of IT administrators believe that their risk of data breach increased significantly in 2018 alone. And you might say, all right, well, that's an enterprise concern, but I don't need to worry because I work for SMB. And actually, in reality, 61% of data breach victims last year were at companies with fewer than 1,000 employees. Hackers are not discriminating. Second, employees are using more apps every day, and since they can adopt those apps without going through IT, as an IT administrator, you have less visibility into where your data is living. It used to be that the data was consolidated in a handful of enterprise applications. But when there are SaaS apps that, for every type of team and every market, for every piece of data, the number of apps the IT department has to stay on top of starts to explode. You used to have a couple of key providers, and then maybe you move those to the cloud, like Office 365, and then Slack. And then it ends up that the average enterprise employee is using 36 different SaaS apps. And across the company, you have frequently over 1,400 apps, different cloud services that are being used in an enterprise. And all that adds up to the third big challenge that IT administrators face, which is governance. Simply put, managing all of those apps is hard. And we don't make it easy. Atlassian's products like Jira Software, Service Desk, Confluence, they all see bottoms-up adoption within companies. And so just like many other SaaS apps, they expand virally. You have individual teams that adopt one of the tools, and then it expands within the company, and people are putting it on their own credit card. And that means that by the time that the IT department realizes that they need or want to centralize, there are already multiple Jira instances or different teams using Bitbucket repositories that you have to get a handle on. And so if you're an Atlassian admin and it feels like your job is less about deploying our products and more about wrangling them, then you're definitely not alone. That is the story we hear from every one of our customers. If you're using Atlassian products on premises, you may be used to a landscape that looks like this. You've got a company instance of each product, Confluence, Jira, Bitbucket, and it's all connected to a corporate Active Directory or LDAP server. Both the cloud achieving the same level of governance, it becomes a little bit more complicated. The IT department might set up Service Desk and Confluence across the company in order to handle internal IT service requests and do a knowledge base. And then the engineering department sets up Jira Software and starts adopting Bitbucket. And meanwhile, in the marketing department, you've got Jira Core or Trello being used. And potentially, at the same time, there's still collaboration happening in Office 365 and Slack as well. And so with that in mind, it's a pretty scary world out there managing applications in the cloud. So I've consulted with Atlassian experts far and wide and tried to put together our top 10 tips for running Atlassian Cloud applications at scale. Whether you're 100 people planning to go to 1,000, you're already at 1,000 or 10,000. Or you're just thinking about what your cloud journey is going to look like. Hopefully these are things that are practical and you can apply regardless of your situation. So the first thing that you need to do in order to get a handle on your applications is really define what your company is in the cloud. And luckily, Atlassian has built a concept to represent that. We call it an organization. So to explain what organizations are, I want to start with the most fundamental difference between our on-premises applications and our cloud apps, which is that in the cloud, each user has a single Atlassian account, one per email address. So that means our user, let's call her Helen. Helen has one company identity, whether it's for her company Acme's Jira Cloud instance or the Confluence instance that she uses to work with a partner or for her Bitbucket repositories. And that's great for Helen. She only has to manage one, she only has to set one password. She only has to configure two-factor authentication once. She only has to pick one stellar profile picture. But it creates a lot of challenges for Acme, her company. Because they have a whole different set of concerns. If Helen is just using her Atlassian account in all these places, then they need to make sure that if that account is compromised, they can deactivate it right away and make sure that it can't be used to create vulnerabilities for their data. And her company is actually the source of truth for her job title, her email address, her location. And if Helen saw that demo of deleting her account that Anu showed in the keynote yesterday, and gets really excited about her right to be forgotten, then it's actually Acme's administrators that are responsible for deleting her account. And so the reality is that as companies grow, Atlassian Cloud usage becomes more fragmented. And when you have many more departments or you acquire companies and you have M&A or different geographies that have their own pockets of usage, getting a handle on all of your Helens, that becomes a little bit more complicated. A couple of products in one department today might be a dozen products in the whole company tomorrow. And as the complexity increases, so does the importance of having that one view in the company. You might be familiar with sites. Sites are a concept that we use for Jira and Confluence that allow you to manage access in the cloud and share groups and settings between them. So in this example, we have two sites, acme.atlassian.net with Jira Service Desk and Confluence, and another one, acmeeu.atlassian.net, and that has Jira Software. And both sites have some folks from Acme working in them. Those are the people in purple. But Acme EU also has some different Acme employees and some contractors that work in a different geography. And so they also have access to that Jira software instance. So Acme's administrators need one place where they can see everything. So we created a new concept called organizations. So organizations allow you to get a unified view of all the users of Atlassian Cloud apps that work at your company and all of your Atlassian Cloud products and services. And since you might have more than one site, we created a new destination that can sit outside of the site that brings it all together. And that's the Atlassian Admin Hub, which is at admin.atlassian.com. But how do you actually get those users into your organization? It's got to be a lot more than smashing sites together, because remember, you might have some instances out there with people that don't work for Acme, and you definitely might also have Acme employees that are working in Atlassian products that you don't even know are being used. So instead, we use a process called domain claim for Acme's administrators to verify their ownership of the acme.com domain. And once they've verified their domain, Acme's IT administrators can manage every single user that has an acme.com email address that Atlassian knows about. Even when those users use their account to access a Jira instance that's owned by another company, Acme IT retains ownership of that account. I'm going to skip the technical details on how domain claim works, but you can see that at the organization level, you can trigger and view the domain claim process. And so then once you've verified a domain, you end up seeing a screen that looks like this, that shows you all of the accounts that are managed by your organization and what products and sites that they have access to. You can edit that information. You can see if they've enabled two-factor authentication. Or you can even disable their account across all Atlassian Cloud products and services. We're really excited about organizations because they provide IT administrators a single point for visibility and control that you've never had with Atlassian products before. But that's actually just the start. Before I go farther, I just want to reiterate that everything that I just described is available to all admins at no cost. You actually don't even need to be using any of our cloud products right now in order to do what I just showed. You can go to admin.atlassian.com, go through the domain verification process, and start to just get visibility on all of the Atlassian Cloud usage at the company. So once you've got this picture of all your users, one of the first things people usually want to do is see who's actually using their account. You might have people who've left their company years ago or partners you no longer work with that still have accounts under the domain. Usually admins are pretty incentivized to remove people's access because you don't want to pay for people not using their account, but deactivating that account is a pretty good idea. That old account can get compromised, and then hackers might use it to try to re-access your data, or maybe they'll use it to post spam in the Atlassian community, and then we have to go delete that spam, and people look at you weird because you're the company that keeps spamming Atlassian community. We don't want to do that. The point is, how do you actually do this? It's really easy. From your organization overview, you can go to any user's account, and there's a drop-down menu here, and with a bunch of different options, including resetting the password, excluding them from two-factor authentication, or deactivating or even deleting the account. And just below, you can see all the products that the user has access to and which ones they're administrators of, so that you know exactly what you're getting into. But what about the users that have access and you just need to make sure that they have access to the right things? That's where we cross the line between the users themselves and the data that they have access to. You should be regularly reviewing the configuration of permissions in your products to make sure that the right users have access to the right content. At a high level, the most important places you need to check are permission schemes in Jira projects. You can use the handy projects column here on the permission schemes page to see which permission schemes are actually in use and by which projects. In Jira's next-gen projects, we've actually tried to simplify the permission structure so it's easier to understand. We know that this can be painful because they're not as granular as the existing permission schemes and not as easy to share. We're absolutely working on this. You'll also want to check Confluent space permissions and the default permissions for new spaces and Bitbucket repositories if you're using Bitbucket. I reached out to Russell Zara, he's a longtime Atlassian administrator, to share some advice on how to optimize this. And he told me that his company, Elsevier, uses a Jira project where each user has a ticket that details their access entitlements and the current status that Elsevier knows about for that user, whether they're active or they've been deprovisioned. And then their security team runs a script that compares what that user has access to in Jira and Confluence with what they're supposed to have access to on that ticket in the other Jira project, and then produces a list of potential mismatches that the IT team can review. If you're interested in learning more about Russell's power tips, I highly recommend that you check out his talk. It's at 4 p.m. today in Mandalay Bay AB over there. Just as important as reviewing data access is admin privileges. This is my 10th summit, and the absolute #1 thing that I have heard from Atlassian admins for 8 years is every time I take over an instance, there are always way too many people that have been made admins of this instance. And that's really dangerous. To get a handle on administrative permissions, the first thing you need to do is understand what that landscape looks like. There are 3 main levels of administration that you should be worried about. The first is org admins, so that's the organization that I showed earlier, because they can do stuff like delete users. And then you have site administrators, and the challenge there is that they work across a Jira product and a Confluence product. They can invite users to the instance, they can install apps, and those things can affect the bill that you ultimately pay. And then finally, you have Jira and Confluence admins who can create projects and spaces, edit workflows, and they can just generally wreak havoc if they don't know what they're doing. So the first thing we recommend is someone that anyone can do, which is just audit the people that have these various levels of permission. And then below these, you also have project and space administrator, or actually, sorry. It's particularly important to understand who has those permissions because those permissions are not super granular. So you want to really make sure that every single person who has one of those permissions actually needs to do most of the things that those permissions provide. Below those, you have project and space permissions in Jira and Confluence. This risk is a little bit more contained because they can only affect a particular project or space, and then there's actually a lot of granularity. I think Jira has 33 different permissions, which can be really fun to learn about. Luckily, there's a tool that actually helps you resolve situations where something might have gone wrong in this area, and it's called audit logs. Jira audit logs are great for stuff like Jira permission changes. For example, this is my Jira instance, and it looks like Fernando has made a change here to a permission scheme, the default software scheme, where he gave himself the administrator permission on every single one of my Jira software projects. That's not cool. Confluence has similar functionality for space creation and space permissions. But there's a big problem with the audit logs that we have in Jira and Confluence today. They don't have the whole picture. Sure, you have Jira-specific permissions that are in the Jira audit log, and most people manage permissions and access with groups. And groups are actually managed at the site level since they can be shared across Jira and Confluence. And then there's the things that I showed earlier, like deactivating a user across all of Atlassian or resetting their password. And that happens at the org level. And sites and orgs don't have audit logs. Until now. We're happy to announce that organization-wide audit logs that cover all user and group changes across all of your Atlassian products are now available as part of Atlassian Access. This will allow you to see user and group activity about every site that's linked to your organization. And it shows you details about who has changed group memberships, granted access to these different groups, and more. This is a big step forward for IT administrators who need a single source of truth. And this is actually just the start. So we're going to be eventually bringing all of the different audit data across all of our products into this one organization level audit log so that you as an IT administrator can have a single view of everything in one place. So if you're interested, you can get a demo of this feature at the Atlassian Access booth. And we're also pleased to announce that we're going to be partnering with some of the leading cloud security providers to make this data available in their CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, and data leak prevention products. So if you're an existing customer of one of these tools and you're interested in using it with your Atlassian products, please come to the Access booth and talk to us. We're really interested in learning more about your use cases. Next recommendation, create a security checklist for your team. Anyone can have a security checklist. Actually, you can have multiple checklists. You might have a checklist for requirements for software that you're going to procure. You might have another for regulations and controls on who can have access. And then you might have checklists that are just contextual to your company that you need for your own internal processes. Everyone's got different requirements. But in general, we want you to consider the data that you store in our products, who has access to that data, and what you're going to do in case you run into a security issue. We try to get the ball rolling with a best practices guide that documents the security measures that we recommend for every customer in Atlassian Cloud. Honestly, if you're in this talk, you probably have, or you're hearing a lot of them already, but we're investing really heavily in our security capabilities and the community around them. So please engage with this guide, give us feedback, visit us at the Access booth, and tell us what security measures you need in our products to be confident. You can get this guide at go.atlassian.com/cloud-admin-security-guide. Also, the slides will be available, so don't stress. You can just Google it also. So now I want to get to the big stuff. The most important thing that you can do to prevent your users from being compromised is to set up SAML single sign-on. SAML single sign-on gives you a single point of control for all user access across all Atlassian systems. You can make sure that every user is logging in and meeting your company's requirements for strong passwords, multiple factors of authentication, logging in, ensuring that they're logging in from approved locations and approved devices. And that all comes via your single sign-on provider. We have official support for 5 of the most common identity providers, as well as instructions for setting up your own SAML connection with a provider that's not on this list. In addition, we're actively working on supporting Active Directory federated services and Google Cloud Identity. And so this is the single most important thing that you can do to ensure that all of your authentication is going through a single endpoint. And it takes you one step closer to solving some of those big IT security problems that you see across all of your SaaS apps. SAML SSO basically allows you to set up authentication policies in your identity provider, like Okta, and then Atlassian account, that helen.acme.com account that I showed earlier will delegate all of her authentication to that identity provider. And it also makes users' lives easier, because they can access Atlassian products in just one click from a dashboard like this one. This is actually what my dashboard looks like at Atlassian. But you can actually go further than SAML SSO, because SAML SSO is actually only just about authentication. What you really want is to manage everything in the identity provider. If you have an identity provider, it gives you a single source of truth, not just for Atlassian, but for all of your SaaS applications. And that's really critical to not just improving security, but also scaling your organization in the cloud. As you have more and more users coming and going from your company, it becomes more and more difficult to manage their access to individual applications. If you can have a central source of truth and everything just syncs automatically, you can reduce the likelihood of human error. So to facilitate user provisioning, we use a protocol known as SCIM. It allows you to manage access to Atlassian applications and control group memberships in an external identity provider like Okta. And then you can sync those details to your Atlassian products. So you can assign a user to Atlassian applications, and then we will automatically detect that addition of the user and provision an account for them in Jira or Confluence. Or if you change a group membership, we'll sync the updated members of the group to Jira or Confluence instances that you choose. There are 3 big benefits to user provisioning. The first is that it simplifies employee onboarding. When someone joins the company and is added to the company's directory, you can quickly grant them access to Atlassian applications. And second, it helps you manage costs. When people are coming and going rapidly, it can be really hard to keep track of which people at the company are still active and who still needs access to the product. By using provisioning to integrate Atlassian products with your HR or your identity source of truth, you can make sure that if you've deactivated somebody in your Active Directory or your identity provider, that they'll automatically be deprovisioned from Atlassian products so that you're not billed for a Jira and Confluence seat that you're not using. And third, since our implementation supports sync in groups, you can actually use those group memberships to not just manage access to the individual products, but actually authorization to at lower levels as well. So you can grant specific groups access to Jira projects or the ability to edit pages in Confluence, and you can control the membership of those groups in the identity provider. So, tip number 10, last but not least, we need to talk about apps. And not just the apps that you get from the Atlassian Marketplace. For most large organizations, for every Marketplace app that you install, there's also going to be scripts and bots and integrations that are also accessing your Atlassian data. So in broad strokes, there are 3 ways that non-humans can access your data. First, you have Marketplace apps. Those are the ones that everybody knows and love, all the folks over there. They can only be installed by a Jira and Confluence administrator. So what you need to do when you install them, you can see which data that app's going to be able to access. And you want to make sure that, one, you're reviewing the app security statement that we require every vendor to provide. That will tell you what the vendor is doing with that data, how they're using it, how they're storing it, and how they secure it. And second, you want to make sure that the users who can install those apps are the people who actually understand what's the data that that app might have access to and can make a responsible decision about whether or not it's safe to install. The second type of app that that might have access to your data is apps that use three-legged authentication, or 3LO. These apps might have a marketplace listing, or they might not. But they can be authorized by any user in your instance, but they only have data that that user has access to. So this is, you might be less familiar with this type of app at Atlassian, but it's because it's pretty new for Jira and Confluence, but it's a super common pattern, so you've probably seen a screen that looks like this at some point in your internet life. So here I'm granting access to the Atlassian Cloud app for Gmail to my Jira instance so that it can create issues on my behalf as I'm looking at emails, Jira emails in my Gmail. So we built visibility for admins into the usage of this feature in site administration. So there's a connected apps page, and you can see the different apps that users have authorized. And we're doing more work here in the future to give you better controls, like the ability to whitelist or blacklist certain apps in advance. And then last but not least, there's basic authentication. So basic auth is the way that most scripts and bots access Atlassian products. In the past, we've supported basic authentication with usernames and passwords. We deprecated that. You should not be using passwords when you've set up your scripts and bots. It's a great way to introduce vulnerabilities that you shouldn't have, and it won't work if you have two-factor authentication enabled for your users or SSO enabled, which you should really consider doing. So don't use passwords for basic authentication. We created a solution as an alternative to passwords, and that's called API tokens. So any user can create an API token, and you can use it to bypass two-factor authentication. And it's easy to revoke those tokens if something goes wrong. But obviously, as an administrator, you've required two-factor authentication or SSO for a reason. You want to keep your data secure, so you want to know which users are using these tokens. So if we go back to the user account page here at our organization and we scroll down just a bit, we can see that we actually have an API token section here where you can see whether a user has created API tokens, when they were created, when they were last used, and if you have an Atlassian Access subscription, you can even revoke them on the user's behalf. And as we develop this feature further, we'll be adding additional controls so that you can restrict exactly which users should even be allowed to create the tokens in the first place. So there you have it. Top 10 tips to make Atlassian Cloud products a little bit more secure and a little bit more scalable. With that, I'm going to shut up because I would rather take your questions than give you another summary. So thank you all so much. It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Good morning. Around the logs, is there any ability to ship those audit logs to a third party like Splunk or something like that?
Yep. So that's definitely on our roadmap. So we're working with both the security providers that I showed on screen, as well as SIEM providers for security teams as well. We want to make sure that we solve both of those use cases in the long run. It's just a matter of which ones we can. Each one of these takes a fair amount of partnership first, but audit logs, APIs, absolutely in our near-term plans.
Hi, Joe Purcell from Airbnb. I'd like to learn a little more about your upcoming Google identity that you said was coming soon. Could you explain that and how you plan to introduce that into the Atlassian tools?
Yeah, so Google offers a relatively new identity service called Google Cloud Identity, and so in the same organization level view where you can configure SAML SSO for and use the provisioning for all the other identity providers we listed. We're working on the same implementation with Google Cloud Identity as well. But feel free to grab me after, and we can go into more of the technical details.
Hi, I was just wondering, how do you set up the AD groups in the tool?
Yeah, so if you're just using an on-premises Active Directory, all of the identity providers that I showed on screen provide connectors to Active Directory, which will allow you to sync groups that you've configured in Active Directory to the cloud identity provider. Or you can go with an architecture where those groups are actually mastered in the identity provider, like Okta, and Okta is the actual source of truth for user and group memberships. So in that case, like Okta has functionality for creating groups, and then you'll just choose which groups should be provisioned to Atlassian, and Okta will automatically, or Azure AD or any of the other identity providers will sync those groups over to Atlassian.
Sorry. So you need an identity provider to set it up in the tool? You can't just set it up directly in the tool?
We provide the SCIM API as a public REST API, so you could write your own integration directly from your Active Directory to Atlassian Cloud, but it's pretty difficult, and it's pretty difficult to implement that on your own, and it's usually a lot easier to go through an identity provider. Obviously, the value of an identity provider increases if you're not just using it for syncing AD to Atlassian, but if you're using it to connect AD to all of your different SaaS applications.
Hi, so I'm just, this is more of a request than a question, but if you're not already, could you please encourage or incentivize your marketplace vendors to do some development with SSO? Because I've already run into an issue where there's a feature in an add-on, or I'm sorry, app, that won't work because I'm using SSO, and the vendor is being very vague about availability, timeline, whatever.
That's actually the first time I've heard that, but grab me after, and I'd love to have a conversation, or we can go tell me which apps they are, and we can follow up with the vendors directly to see what the problems you're running into are. There's one in the middle there.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Is Access available for free for higher ed customers? In other words, .edu domains?
Come see me after the show, and we do for educational institutions. We do have some special pricing, so come talk to me afterwards. All right. Oh, wait, one more.
So when you guys first rolled out Atlassian Access till now, what are some lessons learned that you've had, or some things that you thought were going to work and you've experienced with your customer feedback didn't quite work the way you thought that it would? And how has that made Atlassian Access stronger? I'm setting you up, I'm sorry.
That's a great question. I swear I did not plant him. The number one thing that I think that we have learned over the last 10 months since we launched Atlassian Access was Atlassian as a company didn't do a great job at helping folks understand the difference between those different levels of administration that I showed earlier. So we saw that a lot of administrators were struggling to understand, okay, I have my site and now there's this access thing which is in an organization, and I click a button called security to get to my organization. It was really painful because we would watch user interview after user interview of people who'd managed to set it up and then couldn't figure out how they hacked through the navigation to set it up, to show us how they'd set it up. So we actually invested quite a bit, and we're rolling out a brand new navigation pattern for all cloud administration that's above the product level. So you'll see a brand new administration in site administration and then an org administration, and it tries to tie those concepts a little bit better so you have a much clearer view of your organization and the products that are linked to it. And then on top of that, we want to make sure that we see Atlassian Access as a lot more than just single sign-on and user provisioning. We want to make sure that it's a tool that provides a ton of value for anybody who's administering Atlassian Cloud applications at scale. So that's why there's investments in things like audit logs and API token controls, because we want it to be a no-brainer investment where there's a ton of return for setting up that subscription. So we've made sure that we've invested in things that don't necessarily even require you to do a domain claim. So the audit logs feature is just dependent on which sites you've linked up to your organization. And we plan to build additional functionality in the future that's more about getting that holistic view of the content that your organization owns rather than just the users that belong to your company. Great, well, I really appreciate everyone taking the time. Feel free to come talk to me right after this or over at the Atlassian Access booth. We'll be there all day. Thank you.